Today's episode features discussion about sexual abuse, pedophilia, and Christian nationalism, which may be upsetting for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. DL, welcome to the Ex-Homeschoolers Club. I'm so stoked to have you on the show today.
Thank you. I was just telling you, I never get to talk about being homeschooled, so this could be fun. Question mark?
Yeah. No, I think it's going to be really great. For the audience, DL is somebody who has a project called Strong-Willed, which, if you are familiar with Focus on the Family at all, you know Strong-Willed Child is kind of one of the major books from that and teachings of that. And so it's kind of based off of that. And I've been listening to your podcast and kind of just like following along with what you do on Instagram and some of the things you post there. And so I'm excited not only to talk about your homeschool experience, but also to talk about Focus on the Family. But yeah, I didn't until literally maybe an hour or two ago, I didn't know you were homeschooled. And I had kind of been digging, trying to find in a bio or something if you had said like, oh yeah, I was a homeschool kid. But I was like, I'm not sure. So we'll see where it goes. But fill me in on your homeschool experience a little bit. Like, when were you a homeschool kid? How long were you a homeschool kid for? What was the homeschool experience like? Siblings, that kind of thing. Walk me through, give me a taste of your homeschool life.
Sure. I feel like I used to talk about it a tiny bit more, just in a very short way. Just as a way of introducing people to me, I would say I'm a homeschooled pastor's kid, right? And this is especially in the time I was writing books for Christian publishing. I was, doing speaking engagements for Christian publishing, all that stuff. Now I don't talk about it as much, but that's whatever. It's interesting thinking about the narratives I was told about the reasons I was homeschooled. Um, I remember telling people like, yeah, my mom was just terrified that public school would cause us to leave the faith and we would go to hell. I told people that. Like, that was the reason we homeschooled. And now, I am 42 years old. I'm like, that's a really weird argument for anything. But also, I just think it's really a flimsy one as well. Also, it didn't work. I'm no longer a Christian. I am destined for the flames. So sorry, mom and dad. It didn't work. But we had just an interesting family life. The more I get older and I go to therapy and all that, it's like we had some issues in our family. My dad was an evangelical pastor, and we moved every 2 to 3 years, like clockwork, And my family always framed it as God's leading us to a new adventure.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure about all the reasons why we moved all the time, but I'm assuming it's just broken relationships, church drama. My dad was always at these like smaller evangelical churches all along the West Coast. So yeah, maybe this will be interesting to your listeners, but I was homeschooled in states like Alaska, Wyoming, California, I guess not Oregon, but just, there is a bit of a variety in each state, and there was like a little bit of a difference to our homeschooling in each state. I'm the middle of 3 children, and I was the one who did the best with homeschooling. I am a very self-motivated learner. I'm a huge reader. Reading was my main dissociation, coping mechanism. Even though I wasn't given a lot of access to books. I don't know if you remember like these huge Norton anthologies of like English literature. And
I think so.
yeah, so like we would get those, right? And my older sister would read some of it. I would be assigned some of it. And instead, I just read through the entire thing, right? I'm reading everything over and over and over again just because we didn't have access to that much. And
Yeah.
so I really did well. However, I saw my younger sister in particular really struggle academically, and just there being no avenues or resources to help her. And so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard. I always told everybody I loved being homeschooled because I would get all my work done in a few hours, and then I would just read. I would play with my cats. I would go explore outside. And now that I've been diagnosed autistic, I'm like, I can see how that did work out pretty well for me in some ways. But again, since I'm autistic, I would say like 10 years ago, I started buying some of the history textbooks my mom used with me from Abeka, Bob Jones, and just because I wanted to see how kind of awful the history was in particular, and it was way worse than I remembered. And so I've also had to sort of grapple with the amount of indoctrination that was an essential component to my homeschooling when we were actually homeschooled. So I don't know if this will resonate to anyone else, but there were certain years where my mom didn't do anything with us. I remember one year we lived in Wyoming and she was like, okay, we're going to read all the Little House on the Prairie books and try and cook acorn pancakes. And that's it for this year. So, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
that was it. I was like, great. I guess I can reread, my Anne of Green Gables book for the 20th time. And
Right.
that's it. And so now I'm looking back, like, she was probably just depressed and just totally was like, that's all I have in me this year. And so somehow I kind of got through it. And then when I was in 11th grade, we moved to Central Oregon to a small town. And I asked my parents if I could go to the local high school because it was like 400 kids. And so they said, yeah. So then I went to school for like almost 2 full years. But yeah, my parents' academics was not important to them. They wanted me to be a missionary. And my mom also experienced a lot of, I would call it religious psychosis about the end of the world. Again, I'm just throwing out all these things and I'm wondering like who will resonate and who will not. But that was a huge part of my mom
Mhm.
is she always believed the end of the world was coming. So we always had lots of homeschool doomsday prepper friends. And we were not as intense as them, but that's only because my dad was sort of like, I don't really believe in all this, but sure, I'll stockpile for
Yeah.
Y2K, but I don't really believe it. So that was a huge part of the homeschooling movement for me and
Yeah.
my family as well. Okay, that was a lot of info.
No,
Sorry.
that's really good because I think it gives a really good snapshot of like this show is all about the difference of experience, right? But
Mhm.
there's always things that tie together any of us, right? Because there's something in there that resonates. Like you mentioned like your parents homeschooled for religious reasons, for that
Yeah.
kind of like fear of indoctrination from public school. And like the reasons I was given were much more had to do with like we were moving. My mom was kind of had this worm in her ear from my grandma and some friends who were homeschool parents about doing it. And she was like, I think I can do it. And also, I don't love the school system in the area. And whether that's like the truth or whether she was afraid, like that was always the reason I was given was just kind of like, hey, we didn't love the school system in the area. So we just figured let's do it at home for a little bit and see if it works. But you can always go back to public school. It's not a big deal if that's the case. And then it just worked. So to speak. And she definitely, I think, structured it a little bit more. We had years that maybe weren't quite as structured, but it definitely there was always math, there was always science, there was always history, kind of a deal. Like she was like, okay, we do need some kind of a schoolroom setting. But you brought up Little House on the Prairie, and I remember those books. I was also like a voracious reader and reading. I think I read all those books in a week. It was like a book a day,
Oh
kind
wow.
of a deal.
Yeah.
And I just devoured books. And so to your point of like, you know, your mom would hand you a book and say, "Oh, you just only need to read this section of this
Yeah.
section, right?" And you were like, "I'll just read the whole thing." That was how I was too. It was just hand me a textbook, hand me whatever. Like I'll just read the whole thing. It's not a big deal. I got fast at it. Also, the more you read, the faster you get, right? So it's like even today, it's like I just can devour books if necessary. So I definitely resonate, and I know there are people who have been on the show and listened that will resonate with different parts of your story because it again, we have those weird connection points and like we talk about a lot on the show of like I think homeschoolers can kind of smell and sniff out other homeschoolers. Like I said at the beginning, I didn't know you were a homeschool kid
Yeah.
until literally this morning. But I had this like gut feeling that it was like maybe true. I was like, I think it's possible that DL is a homeschool kid, but I
Mhm.
don't know for
Mhm.
sure. So so thank you for sharing that. I'm curious the role that like maybe Focus on the Family, Adventures in Odyssey, because that's primarily what we're going to talk about today, like played in your homeschool life. Because I know for my family, we waited every week for like the new Adventures in Odyssey episode was dropping. I don't know, Saturday, Sunday night, something like that, and we were prepped. We were ready. That was like on the calendar, and there was no moving it. You know, we knew that that was coming. And as far as Focus on the Family was on the radio nonstop. It just felt like that was the show we listened to
Yeah.
every day at
Hmm.
lunch, kind of a thing. And so I'm curious, kind of what role Focus on the Family played in your upbringing. Obviously, religious family, pastor kid. You know, what was their role in your life?
Yeah. So Focus on the Family, for people who don't know, it's this organization started by James Dobson, I believe in, was it 1977? And, the whole thing is helping parents, helping families, grow godly children, godly families, all that stuff. So if you were religiously homeschooled, you probably had some connection with the work of James Dobson. We already mentioned The Strong-Willed Child. He became super famous because he wrote these two books. One was published in 1970. It was called Dare to Discipline. And basically, he made the case that people like Fred Rogers, these permissive parenting experts, were ruining America. And we needed to go back to the Christian method of disciplining your children, including, using corporal punishment, spanking your toddlers every time they asserted their will. That was his whole thing. That sold millions of copies. And then in 1977, he published his second book, The Strong-Willed Child, which was like, hey, this is for the kids that even if you spank them a bunch, they still disobey you. Here's what you do. And basically, he just says, spank them more, try and control them more. And so eventually, Focused on the Family, they did get more into education. I think, now I'm not an expert in this part at all, but to me, Dobson became more and more outspoken against public schools. He always was, kind of, but he got more and more that way, and eventually did become a huge person talking about parental rights and like how important it is. And the weird thing is, when you look at Dobson and all the things he was against, right? He was against, even though he himself was a public school teacher in the beginning, he was against public school. He was against therapy. He was against social workers. Basically, all of these people who are mandatory reporters and could be involved in helping a child if they were in an abusive situation. So if you kind of just take a big step back, Dobson really sowed distrust and mistrust of anybody that could possibly be someone who reported abuse. If I'm being perfectly honest, I don't think that's the entirety of the picture, but that's certainly a part of the picture of what Focus on the Family and James Dobson was doing. My mom used to write for Focus on the Family magazine. I had an older brother who died in a car accident, and he was autistic, which in the 80s, that was like hardly a thing. And so my mom wrote a lot about autism for Focus on the Family. Her facts were totally wrong. She believed it was caused by vaccines. And she also wrote often about how in heaven my brother was cured, right? And no longer autistic. And she couldn't wait to get to heaven to meet. So, not a fun legacy of looking up my mom's writings for Focus on the Family, but she was kind of in the Christian publishing world a little bit. And then, of course, we did listen to Adventures in Odyssey, especially on family vacations. And that was a program put out by Focus on the Family for kids, like a audio radio drama. Now, I have to say this for all the Christian homeschoolers listening. Yes, Adventures in Odyssey has great production quality compared to like a lot of Christian media. I agree with you there. It's a steaming pile of dog shit. And so I'm just preparing you for what I'm going to
Yes.
be talking about Adventures in Odyssey going forward.
Yeah.
And I just do that to rip off the Band-Aid because for a lot of homeschooled kids, Adventures in Odyssey is one of the pieces of media they do not want to interrogate. They do not want to think about, and they do not want it to be ruined. And I totally respect that. I honor that. It's a product of James Dobson, so you gotta interrogate it because
I
that
think,
man was a problem. So I guess
yeah.
that's how I'll say it.
I think it's so interesting that you say that because, yeah, I agree. Adventures in Odyssey, like the best quality. And it got me. I work in podcasting,
Yeah.
podcast world. I love radio theater. I wanted to work in the music industry. Like it is a big chunk of me wanting to work in the audio arena. And so I think that's also part of the reason it's hard for me to even like want to have you on to ruin it,
Yeah.
because I'm
Yeah.
like it is this thing that even though I can tell myself in my head, I'm like, okay, yeah, it's a Dobson thing. I know Dobson's not that great. It's like it is a very tough piece. I think we do this a lot with Veggie Tales as well. It's another one of those things that it's like I don't want it ruined because I have fond memories of it, right?
Yeah.
And I need something to hold on to there as well. But let's ruin it. Let's
Should we?
let's do it.
Should we ruin everyone's relationship with this precious piece of their child?
I think we should. And I also, you and I were chatting a little bit before we hit record. Like, I've been to the Focus on the Family campus in Colorado Springs. Is it in
Okay.
Colorado
Yeah,
Springs
it
or in
is.
Denver? Um, and toward it, they have an Adventures in Odyssey section. They have a Wits End.
Uh-huh.
So for anyone who hasn't listened to Adventures in Odyssey, it all centers on Wits End, one building, and it's like a soda parlor shop basically that is designed for kids to come and have fun and drink a soda. And I'm sure you'll get into more of some of the storytelling, but they have this thing, and even as a kid, I remember going and being like, "This is so cool," and this is like, it just. I don't know. He did such a good job of inventing this story that I think appealed to kids and kind of the imagination of wanting to run free and tell Bible stories. But we're gonna ruin that, and that's okay. I'm here. I'm gonna hold anyone who's listening who's scared like I am. Like, I'm gonna hold your hand. We're doing this together.
Yeah.
DL, ruin it for us.
Should we jump in?
Yes.
I'm holding your hand too, everyone. Just so you know, this is not exactly fun for me, but I think the present moment and the next couple of years is just going to sort of validate the fact that we need to rethink a lot of things in pop culture and the
Yeah.
messages they were telling kids. And so if I can just jump into the backstory because it's pretty important. I became obsessed with James Dobson a few years ago. And as an autistic person, I get random obsessions that I must follow through. It's just a part of being me. So I've had my obsessions with like radical Catholic anarchist Dorothy Day. Well, I started getting into James Dobson because I was learning about fascism and Christian fascism in particular. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. I was pretty worried about some patterns I was seeing in the United States. And I read this book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, written in 1933. So, right after Hitler got all his power, by a man named Wilhelm Reich. And the way he described fascism, how it's essential that it's modeled in the family first, so then it can be replicated as a society, which is why fascists focus on the family. That's what he said. And they're obsessed with policing and controlling gender and sexuality. They're obsessed with a patriarchal hierarchy being implemented in the home. They're obsessed with appealing to hierarchy and authority as God's way, right? So that must be, again, implemented in the home. Then you can implement that in society. And oh my God, as I was reading, I was like, this sounds like Focus on the Family, in America. Like, what? And I read a few other books, including one by Alice Miller called For Your Own Good. And it looked at the German Christian parenting methodologies of the 17, 18, 1900s and how they paved the way for an authoritarian leader in Hitler. And everything in those parenting books, I was like, wait a minute. This sounds like Dobson, but like in Germany in the 1800s. But it was all so similar, including the obsession with corporal punishment and the obsession with patriarchal hierarchy and appealing to God, right, as the ultimate patriarchal hierarchy. And that's how you get everybody to kind of submit. So I was like, damn, this sounds a lot like Dobson. So I started rereading a bunch of Dobson books, a bunch of other evangelical parenting books, because Dobson wasn't the only one. I'm sure people listening, there's even more extreme like corporal punishment folks in these worlds. That includes like Michael and Debbie Pearl, that includes the Ezzos, that includes, oh my God, I can't even think of all the names, but comparatively Dobson is actually better than some of these Christian parenting experts, especially ones that came after him who kind of copycatted him. But went even more intense, like the whole blanket training thing, you know, we smack a baby's hand every time they try and leave a blanket. Like it's it's just sadism, honestly. Even Dobson, when you read his books, you're like, man, he's kind of a sadist. If you don't believe me, it's just like read his book, The Strong-Willed Child. In the introduction, he tells this hilarious story about his little dog, a little wiener dog who wouldn't obey him. They got into this huge altercation. He took off his belt. He said he was like beating this dog, you know, over and over and over again until finally he broke the dog's spirit, and that dog never disobeyed him again. He's like, and that's why you should read my book about breaking the will of your strong-willed child. And I'm just like, this is animal abuse. You're a 6 foot tall man. You have this tiny little dog, and you think this is such a great story. But anybody with empathy, compassion, anything would be like, so I think it's really hard to read some of these materials, to go back and be like, if your parent read that and was like, this is great, that's a red flag, yo. I mean, it really is. There was many opportunities for parents to read and be like, this seems unnecessarily cruel. Dobson also was obsessed with viewing children and toddlers as adults who have willful defiance and sin that must be beaten out of them. And I think that's just such a terrifying thing for a parent to believe. I'm a parent myself. And I think that is what really radicalized me and eventually caused me to leave the faith, is I can't treat my kids that way. And it's really sad that that is a core component of how my parents viewed me. Now, Dobson got his start working for a man named Paul Popenoe, who was a very well-known eugenicist and white supremacist, and he's actually the father of modern marriage counseling. He pioneered this whole column called "Can This Marriage Be Saved?" in the Ladies' Home Journal. He started this center in Los Angeles for counseling families. Now, he was only counseling white families, and he was super into eugenics. He was super into Hitler, super into Third Reich. They loved him. They used his policies to like promote the forced sterilization of people in Nazi Germany. He was like, California needs to do this. He was trying to get California to do it. Well, after, World War II was over, and America was like, oh, you can't be like openly supportive of eugenicist policies. So he was like, okay, then let's do positive eugenics. Since the white race is dying out, let's help white women marry white men and stay married, have children, and indoctrinate their children, right, into replicating their values. So that's when Dobson got his start. He worked for Paul Popenoe for 10 years. He was a lecturer. He was an assistant. He did all this stuff. He tried to really hide this part of his history, but he was deeply, deeply involved. And in fact, the center he worked with Popenoe, the year it shut down, the year Popenoe retired, is the year Dobson started Focus on the Family. And he actually modeled Focus on the Family after Popenoe's organization of a positive eugenics center, helping white women marry white men, having a lot of children, and indoctrinating those children into the principles. So if that sounds familiar, it's like, hey, that's what it is. So this is like harsh truth number one, is if you were born into a family that utilized these principles, you were born into a positive eugenics movement, which is a white supremacist movement. And it's obsessed with the patriarchy. And that's why it's obsessed with patriarchal religion, in this case, Christianity. So that's the basis we have to know before we get to talk about Adventures in Odyssey. Anything you want to say, Jacob?
It's so interesting. You did an episode on your podcast about this, and I remember listening to it, and I was out on a walk, and I listened to you talk specifically about this, and I was like, so I paused the episode, and I just say out loud, so James Dobson trained by a Nazi. And I was
Yeah.
like, that's a wild thing to say in 2026. And I think I had listened to this right around the time that he died, so maybe 2025. And I just started crying. And I was just that's the thing about, I think, deconstruction and now being a decade out from childhood, so to speak, past the decade, out from childhood, and starting to look back at a lot of these things that were just normal in our everyday lives. And there will be people who argue, well, there was good stuff in Focus on the Family. Well, yeah, there sure, okay, but where does it all stem from? And I think that's the part that was very, it took me a long time, I think, to sit in that like uncomfortable nature of that and be like,
Mhm.
okay, this was bad. And so again, when we're talking about Adventures in Odyssey and like not wanting to destroy that, it's because it's comfortable. It's because like I have fond memories of it and I have good memories of it, and I think it taught me some good life lessons mixed in with some bad. But like when you look at the history of where does all of this stem from, and it all comes back to Nazi propaganda and Nazi teachings, like holy crap, like that. I want to say no to that. I grew up believing the Nazis were bad. You know what I mean? And so it is a little bit uncomfortable. That's I think all I'm going to say about that. But let's get into Adventures in Odyssey. So what's the next step here?
Yeah, so then, sorry, this is another deep dive. So this was my original thesis. This is why we started the Strong Willed Project, is because I was like, hey, I think one of the reasons America voted for a legit authoritarian and authoritarian policies is because I think people have been trained from birth for the past 5 decades to embrace this as God's plan, right? So I think Dr. Dobson was a child psychologist. He knew the research. And I think he intentionally was helping people stunt their children's development so they would stay in the fold. They would be very good little authoritarian followers, if I'm being perfectly honest, right? So that was my whole thesis. Dobson needs to be explored. His parenting methods, his ideologies, they all need to be explored because, hey, the US is slipping into fascism. Now, my thesis changed in the past few years because the more I studied Dobson, I now have a slightly different theory, which does it involves Inventions and Odyssey, so we'll talk about it here. One of the things Dobson talked about over and over again was, keeping kids safe, supposedly. He has this whole book called Children at Risk, and it's like, here's where children are at risk. They're at risk because of public schools, teaching secularism, teaching humanism. They're at risk because people are being visibly gay every once in a while. Like, oh my God, they're at risk because feminists, right? Taking over everything. They're at risk because of drugs. He loved talking about drugs. He loved like having an index with like 400 slang terms for drugs. So if you want a good laugh, you can just go see the slang terms that Dobson was into about drugs. They're very funny, but he never actually addressed what was really harming kids, which is this pervasive abuse of children within Christian families and, outside of it as well. So he talked a lot about the evils of pornography. This was also a staple of Focus on the Family. I know this topic can be kind of triggering for folks, so I'm just going to give some broad strokes. The reason I started researching this is because Dobson would not shut up about the fact that he was on a presidential commission in 1985 called the Meese Commission on Pornography, where he was one of 11 commissioners. For a whole year, they just talked about pornography and was it contributing to violence? Like, should it be illegal or not? All this stuff. And he just loved to talk about his time, how it was so horrible, and he just did it for the people. And, so I actually went and studied the Meese Commission. I studied the lectures they heard. I read the transcripts of the experts they heard from. And the truth was, in 1984 is when child pornography was finally made illegal. So this was the next year. And so a huge portion of the discussion for that year was talking about child pornography, who makes it, how to stop it, how to prosecute it, how to, all this stuff. So it was a huge, huge issue. And everything Dobson learned in his year on that commission, he did not take that information and share it with his wide audience of families with kids. I find that very troubling, partly because the information he was hearing over and over and over again from the FBI, from social workers, from all these experts in child protection at the time, They said over and over again, it's not the man in the trench coat you should be worried about. It's not the stranger danger, okay? Society likes those narratives because we cannot deal with the reality, which is the vast majority. And even this was true in 1985, and it's somewhat similar to today. 99% of child sexual assault materials are made by a child's family member. Overwhelmingly, the child's father, then the stepfather, and then a smaller population of offenders are people who are what they call acquaintance molesters. So, like pillars of the community, a coach, a pastor, a volunteer somewhere. So, that was it. So, they had even people like Mitch McConnell testifying in front of Dobson and others saying, like, actually, the profile of a child molester is a middle-aged white man, married, in some kind of position of authority, some kind of pillar of the community. And the reason we need to focus on them and talk about them is because they are repeat offenders. They are 5 times more likely than any other kind of criminal to repeat their crimes, which is sexually abusing and sexually exploiting children. So people are really intense about this topic because personal computers were just starting to become a thing. The FBI was like, this has a potential to be really bad because pedophiles love to find each other. They love to share materials. They love to share images. Like, this could actually get way worse. So we really need to talk about this. One of the other things I discovered was that Dobson was like the conservative Christian on this commission. There was also a Catholic priest named Father Bruce Ritter on the commission. Him and Dobson both, right, hate pornography. They want all of it outlawed. Well, the year after this commission, it comes out that Father Bruce Ritter himself was a pedophile, and he had been accused of molesting, I believe, at least 14 people, including children that he helped house in this home he started for wayward youth in Times Square. He was sexually abusing them at the same time, right? Yet here he was on this commission saying, all of this is bad. Only Christians have the moral capacity to say this is all bad. So that happened. This is important because Dobson served on the commission in 1985. 1986, his buddy Bruce Ritter is outed as a serial child pedophile. He never faced any consequences, by the way. He just retired and went to live in a farm for priests in upstate New York.
I mean, why would we? Why would we prosecute any of these people? That's the thing I've been so interested in realizing recently, and I know I'm gonna totally derail what you were saying, but it's just the fact that over and over and over again we see that the statistics point to church leaders. They point to pillars of the community, like you were saying,
Yep.
right? And yet a lot of those men, they're church going people, right? And then there's the forgiveness movement of
Yep.
there is no consequences to their actions, and we see it repeated again and again and again. We see it with the recent conversion of high profile people like Russell Brand, right?
Yeah,
Who gets
totally.
he's convicted or he's accused of sexual abuse, and then what does he do? I'm a Christian. Guess what?
Yeah.
I'm all good. I'm washed in the blood of the Lamb. Like, I'm good. And what do we do in the Christian world? We continually prop him up. We put him as a speaker at these events to tell his testimony of his come to Jesus moment. There is no consequences for his actions. There is only, let's just continue to pay this man buku dollars and prop him up as a leader of this movement. It's just really bizarre to me, and I don't understand why that is. Like, and again, it's something I'm deep diving on now more so because I fall into that category. I'm a straight white guy. I grew up in a lot of this too. I'm trained to just wash away and be okay with when other white guys just do bad shit, right? It's okay. They're messed up person, and it's like, that's not the reality. There's consequences to our actions. So that's my aside.
No,
I'm sorry, but
I think that's great because let me just take it back again to the parenting methods many of us who were homeschooled were raised with, right? Is corporal punishment. And again, going based off of what Dobson said, there was no forgiveness of sins for a 2-year-old who's saying no to their parent. They get consequences, physical consequences. They must say sorry. They must feel pain. They must cry to be absolved. And yet we see men, they're forgiven when kids are not even forgiven in these systems. So like once you can kind of see the power dynamics at work, you can see it for the charade that it is. And I just think like my most recent post is on the forgiveness clause and how that enables abusers to get away with their crimes, because the two things, so again, obsessing about Dobson means I now know way more about serial child predators than I ever wanted to know. And because of studying the Mies Commission, they said the two things a serial child predator is always looking for is they're always looking for a steady supply of children, right? Access to victims. And they're also looking for ways to get away with their crimes, right? To not be held accountable. Now, they find that in patriarchal Christian spaces, because those spaces are geared, right, to elevate the man, to elevate a Christian. Even in 1985 on the Mies Commission, they're talking about, there's all these studies like if a man was even convicted of crimes against children, which rarely happens, if he was a Christian and if he had community members testify to his good character, the judge would just give the most lenient, sentence available, right? Then, so even in 85, they're saying people are saying they're Christians and saying they're pillars of the community to get away with their crimes. And like, we need to know this is the profile of a predator. It's not this creepy weirdo in the park. It's the businessman with all his friends. And going back to Father Bruce Ritter, he started this house, the Covenant House for runaway youth. He ended up abusing youth in there, but he stacked his board with like a who's who of like New Yorkers, right? Of powerful New Yorkers. And that was one of the reasons why he escaped all accountability, is because all of these powerful people were like, he's our bud. We're not going to do anything about it. So these are all the systems at play that keep predators safe while making sure children are not seen and not heard and their abuse is not taken seriously. I think this is still obviously a huge deal in 2026. We have Epstein, we have all this shit going on. Even with AI, there's so many issues when it comes to this sexual exploitation of children. And in conservative Christian world, in homeschooling world, it's like, no, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen in Christian families. We're all very anti this stuff. But the thing is, Dobson heard all that material, plus he had this experience with Father Bruce Ritter. And what does he do the very next year? He creates a children's program centered around a man in his 50s or 60s who has an ice cream soda parlor for children, right? Where he interacts with children constantly. And he also indoctrinates them into Christianity and like revisionist history, right? Parents are pretty peripheral in Odyssey world. I think we can all sort of agree to that. And Whit is like the the prototype of a man who has made himself a pillar of the community, so that even if, allegations surfaced, every single person would be on his side, right? So he's rich. He I don't even know all the things that he does, right? But he teaches at the school sometimes. He is ahead of like the business things. He gets like pride parade shut down. Like, he knows everyone. And one of the weird themes about Adventures in Odyssey is like, most of the time the kids are wrong, right? The kids are wrong and they need the guidance of Mr. Whitaker to know what to do, or their parents or their church, but usually it's Mr. Whitaker, right? Has the wisdom. Even setting up a show like that, I believe, is irresponsible, right? But this is like the bread and butter of evangelical Christianity. Kids are wrong. Kids are wrong. Kids are wrong. Like, they need help. They need wisdom. They need guidance from God, and therefore from a person like Mr. Whitaker, who says God speaks directly through him, which again is sort of a batshit like claim to make and to promote to kids. So again, what the experts were telling Dobson is you need to share the information about who is most likely to hurt kids. He actually went and did the exact opposite. And I think hopefully in 2026, we can see how serial child predators are very interested in shaping the culture to make it easier for them to get away with their crimes. And I think that is at least a part of what was going on with the creation of Adventures in Odyssey. What do you think, Jacob? Do you think I'm way out of left field?
I don't think you're out of left field. I definitely as you explain it, right? And I'm thinking back to listening to Adventures in Odyssey and thinking about those, like, who are the people responsible, right? And so and who are the people we're turning to when things go awry? I'm thinking specifically of an episode, and I remember a kid, Mr. Whitaker tells him, "Don't go in the imagination station," which is his like uh basically machine that takes you anywhere in the world, right? To any historical moment. It takes you to a Bible story or a lot of different things. But he tells him not to go in it. Kid does it anyways because he just wants to, and then there's some kind of consequences down the line. And I remember, like, I mean, I'm thinking about applying that to my own life and looking at the people I trusted and just like explicitly trusted, and they were the leadership in my life. Not only my parents, my youth pastors, my pastors, you know, specifically a lot of times men who were older than me, just trusting them with whatever. Why would they steer me wrong, right? They're a trusted member of my community, they're a trusted member of my church. Why would I ever think that they would do anything wrong? And then I think about the men that did do things that made me uncomfortable or did, and not wanting to talk about it because, well, why would this person hurt me, right? It's wanting to be silent about it. And it wasn't until much later that I finally was like, this was fucking weird, right? The
Yeah.
way that this dad would hug us, the way that this parent would do this or say this or felt like they had this authority, that's fucking weird, right? And And it was. And I'm not the only one who felt that way. When I started talking to my friends, I realized I'm not alone in this. And I think it's getting to the point of what you were saying is like, for most of our childhood, especially those of us raised with a lot of the focus on the family values, I think there is kind of this understanding that when you step out of line, you get in trouble. You get the wooden spoon, you get the spanking, you get whatever. And even as an adult, I was still living under kind of that feeling of like, well, if I step out of line, if I make it uncomfortable at all for anybody else who's an authority over me, because my parents are still an authority over me, I'm going to get hurt somehow. I'm going to get ostracized. I'm going to get kicked out of my community. I'm going to whatever the
Hmm.
punishment is, that's going to happen to me. And so I think again, it continues to stem this idea of authoritarianism and why we're so comfortable with it, because it's like, why would the people who are in charge want to hurt us? Because sometimes they just fucking do. That's just their reason. So anyway, I'm with you. It's hard to hear. It's hard to hear, to be honest.
I agree. Just like thinking about like the Trump administration, the policies that are hurting so many people. And, we keep hearing this refrain from because the media is obsessed with asking people who voted for Trump how they feel about it. And some, people, especially from various immigrant communities, being like, I just didn't think he'd come after us. Right.
Right.
And, I just think it's just a sad reality that people are starting to understand. I think for me, being a parent really helped me deconstruct a lot of this because as my kids got older, it's like I definitely do not want to teach them that if a man says he is a Christian, you should trust him and you should do what he says. Like, no, like I was still very much a Christian and I was like, yikes, that's a recipe for abuse, if you ask me. And
Yeah.
this was way before I had really unpacked a lot of it. And I think, again, just going back to that, like, why would you teach your kid that at this point? You need to teach your kid, like, first of all, just some really basics of consent and bodily autonomy, and that can and should say no to unsafe and unwanted touches, like on your body. That's just the baseline. Now, Dobson never taught that. And in fact, he taught the opposite. He taught parents, you have to hurt your children physically, right? In order to get them to become Christians and to obey God and to, have a good life or whatever. So I'm like, Dobson already is setting the groundwork for kids who have no concept of consent and will not say no and actually will even believe that they deserve or need, right, this kind of abuse in order to make them good or it gets so sticky so fast. And again, knowing that he was a child psychologist, to me it makes it even more horrifying that
Yeah.
he knew all of this. He worked at a children's hospital. I know he saw case after case after case of horrific abuse against children. And what does he go and do? He says, guess what? You should trust every Christian man in your life. And you need to be on the lookout for queer people and feminists because they're going to hurt your kids. That is not true.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you bring that up because I think that a part of what made him, I think, so credible in the space is that he had the doctor element to it.
Yeah.
He did the training. He went to school. He did the time, right? And so again, it plays into that whole trusting that person who has the authority, they've taken the time, they have the letters in front of their name. And so I think, but as we've come to find out, he's taking the information he's given and he's just tossing it in the bin and saying, nope, that can't be it. We're going to do these other studies. Or I'm going to point to this other direction. And I see that a lot, to bring it back to the homeschool community. We see that a lot in the homeschool community. I remember as a kid continually being told homeschoolers are smarter. We
Mhm.
get into college is a lot easier. We get through college a lot faster than other people. We end up with higher paying jobs. All of these things. And as an adult, I I go and I research those studies. Where did this come from? And I realize it's not true. It's
Yeah.
all fabricated or twisted version of that information that has been paid for by pro homeschool movements. And unfortunately, Dobson was doing very similar things with especially stuff around child abuse and taking those numbers and skewing them or just hiding them altogether. Um, yeah, it's unfortunate to say the least.
Yeah. And, again, I just keep going back to like, as I've read other people, sociologists, psychologists who talk about, one of the most taboo subjects is the prevalence of incest that happens in families. It's much higher than anyone wants to believe. This has been an issue for a long time. I mean, Sigmund Freud, right? Like he had this whole thing where he listened to his female patients who were hysterical, and every single one of them disclosed that they were sexually abused by their father or one of their father's friends. And so he was like, wow, so this causes hysteria, right? And this is happening so much, and especially in the bourgeoisie, right? And so he was like, I can't believe this. But then he got scared and he like rescinded his paper on the subject. And he instead was like, I think these women are sexually attracted to their fathers. And so they made up these stories because secretly, subconsciously, they want to have sex with these men. And that's leading to all this problem. So that is horrifying, right? That's just like and that's the basis of modern psychotherapy right there. These women made it up because secretly they kind of want to have this relationship with their dad. Like, I can't express to you how awful that is. And I think it's good to bring that up. Just like, this is not just a Christian issue. This is like horrible men protecting
Yep.
horrible men, because Freud was basically like, if this is true, then like the people propping up society in Vienna are all child molesters. That can't be true. I just refuse to believe it. These women were making it up. Well, how does that sound in 2026 as we learn more and more about Epstein and the connections politically, economically, socially, and what? It's in media, it's in entertainment, it's in business, it's in politics. Like, this really is a thing that
Yeah.
happens that we must be talking about. Now, Dobson isn't like, Dobson wasn't flying to Jeffrey Epstein's island. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what was happening. But Dobson was creating the conditions where a serial child predator could probably get away with his crimes if he was in these kinds of communities and would
Yeah.
have access to children, possibly even his own children could do this. And then there's multiple ways where the child will not disclose for so many reasons. But that's another thing, is Dobson never told people to report abuse to authorities. Instead, like I mentioned, he told people to homeschool their kids, right, where nobody would be able to know and see, to distrust all therapy and therapists unless it was like a Bible-based therapist. Like all of these places where a child would maybe like have a concerned adult intervene. Dobson was like, no, don't do that. I just think about Focus on the Family has this hotline, a crisis hotline. And I don't know how to get this information, but I'm just curious, like, how many people have called in, disclosed abuse, and I wonder what Focus on the Family tells them, because in none of Dobson's materials does he tell people to disclose that abuse to the proper authorities. And in fact, in his purity culture books and things like that, he often says things like, you know, a father's not really supposed to notice when his 14 or 15-year-old, right, is developed as a woman, but he does. And it's usually quite innocent. And, he just throws out things like that over and over and over again. He sexualizes kids constantly in his writing. And in fact, most purity culture authors do. That's just the sad truth. Purity culture gives them an excuse to talk about kids, tweens, and teens as sexual beings, and to have lots of conversations with kids and teenagers about their sexuality, which in of itself is quite creepy if you ask me. There's just all these things that add up to these communities are obsessed with the sexuality of children. They're also obsessed with this belief that men can't control themselves. I don't know if you grew up with this at all, Jacob,
I was going to bring this up,
guy.
actually.
Yeah.
I was going to bring this up because what you're saying, I'm so thankful. My parents are not perfect, but I'm so thankful for my dad in this one circumstance. And that is that growing up in Southern California, you go to the beach a lot. Well, who are at the beach? People in bathing suits, women in bikinis. Totally fine. As a young man, I remember, especially hitting puberty ages and sexual urges are starting to happen, and that messaging of the uncontrollable lust is coming in, and I remember my dad taking me aside at one point and just saying, "Look, sexual feelings are very natural; they're normal. However, there's always context. When we're at the beach, that's not a sexual environment, so you don't need to be, those feelings don't need to be happening because this is not a sexual environment." And that alone, that just like little nugget helped me so much, because while my other friends were like struggling to peel their eyes away or just existing in that world of being told I am uncontrollable, everything I do, it's like it's a monster living inside of me, right? I think of the show Big Mouth and how they have the hormone monsters that are just like uncontrollable, if anyone's familiar with that show. But I didn't. I'm not gonna say I didn't totally have that problem, but I definitely started to figure out that it was like there's context to everything, and not everything has to be a sexual moment. And I especially don't need to look at, for me, the opposite sex, but I don't need to look at other people always in a sexual context. And that, I think, helped drastically with just my understanding around sexuality and being a sexual person, because it was just it doesn't have to be all the time. It doesn't. But that is the messaging that is continually put in men's brains in the church of just, you are always going to be horny. You are always going to get turned on. You are always this, that, and the other. And it's your job to fight against it. But not even that it's your job to fight against it. It's women's job to not put you in the position to have to fight against it. And so that, again, the more I unpack and the more I learn about my childhood and the purity culture stuff, I reread I Kissed Dating Goodbye this past year, just like unpacking a lot of that understanding of what boys were being taught, what girls were being taught. It's really scary, to be honest, because it set up an environment where men truly don't have to take accountability for their actions, because we are like wild animals, right? And you can't really hold a wild animal responsible for its actions, right? Because it's just a natural part of who it is. I choose to disagree. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
It's not. We're not wild animals. Like we can be trained to not react in certain circumstances and to control our thoughts and things like that. We just don't want to, because for whatever reason, men have this desire to be in control. It's the society we've built. It's the patriarchal society we've built of men have to be in control. We have to be the dominating voice, dominating everything. And it's just like, It's just bullshit. It just really is. At the end of the day, I don't know how else to say it. It just is bullshit. And the more I learn about it, the more I realize I need to just be okay sometimes with other people taking the lead on things and let them handle it. But anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right on. So I was, raised and socialized as female, and I just remember in youth group, that's primarily where I got the purity culture stuff, cuz my parents were pretty hands off on all of that, like very neglectful, teaching me nothing about sex ed, all that stuff. But I just remember hearing things like guys think about sex every 7 seconds. I remember being told like, guys can't help it. It's my job to dress modestly, right? So that not just like the other high schoolers wouldn't stumble, but like so the pastors wouldn't, which again, that's just an
that's
insane
weird.
thing to put on a child. Like if you read some of the purity culture books, it's like, you know, make sure your 12-year-old is wearing a camisole tank top underneath her t-shirt so when she raises her hands in worship, right, you don't see a slip of midriff, which is tempting to men. I'm like, men, 12-year-old stomach, like, it just, why are you normalizing this, you shitheads? These are female writers, by the way, writing
Yeah.
this stuff. And I'm just like, being me. And by the way, I was autistic, like I said. So I'm taking all this in. Plus, I'm getting told that men have to be the spiritual leaders this entire time, while also being told they think about sex every 7 seconds, while also being told they're like wild animals and they're less, but they have to be in charge. Also, if you're gonna date, you should probably court, and the guy has to be the spiritual leader. So, what do you think I did in this situation? I'm just like, I can't be with any of these dipshits. Like, first of all, I knew way more about the Bible than them. Second of all they did was think about sex. Like, I couldn't make it work because it doesn't make sense the way this is set up.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I guess I'll never date then, because I cannot reconcile. They have to be the spiritual leader of me, but then they're just like these little hormone freaks, and that's all they think about. Like, this is just setting up for predators to get away
Yeah.
with their crimes against children and women. That's really what's at the basis of all of this, if I can be perfectly honest, right?
Yes.
And I think once you see that, you can just blow right through the bullshit of purity culture. And that's sort of where my thesis ended up. Is I believe James Dobson made materials that not only appealed and catered to white supremacists, but to serial child predators. And I think he made it easier for them to get away with their crimes. I actually just recently wrote about this, but his daughter, Danae Dobson, she wrote a lot for girls, for Brio magazine. I don't know if anybody listening remembers Brio magazine. That was the one for girls. As Breakaway was for the boys. And she wrote this book of like devotionals for teen girls. And in one of the devotionals on forgiveness, she actually says, like, sometimes people do horrible things to you, but since like Jesus has already forgiven you for your sins, right? There's nothing anybody could do against you that's bigger than that. You've already sinned against God so much that you must forgive those who sin against you. And she even says, horrible things could have happened to you. You might even have been raped by someone close to you, someone in your family. This is what she says. My advice to you is to give it to God and let it go. And then she said, I remember a pastor of mine told me one time, you need to put that person who hurt you in Jesus' jail. Let Jesus take care of him. That's what she says. So this is the only time in any of these materials that Dobson put out where I have seen anyone mention the fact that in Christian families, young girls are being sexually abused by people in their families, right? Including fathers, including stepfathers. So I was like, whoa, I can't believe she actually brought that up. But she brings it up to say you have to forgive and you have to let it go. No, never does she say report this abuse to anyone, right? It's just give them to Jesus and he'll sort it out, which again, this is not what parents are being told with their kids. They don't put their kids in Jesus jail. No, they spank the shit out of them till they cry, right? Like that's for kids, but for men who rape their kids, it's you put them in Jesus. I'm so sorry to get so intense, but this is the reality. This is what they are promoting at its
Yeah.
core.
I think what's so interesting again about that is we see one of the things we hear time and time again, right? The women who come forward on Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein. Well, why didn't they come forward sooner? We have built a world in which what we've been talking about, there's this indoctrination to forgive, to forget, to put it behind you, to all of these things. And sometimes it takes years, decades. It takes so long to get to the point where you're finally like, this wasn't right. And I actually need to talk about it. Like I was mentioning with like a homeschool dad who just made me uncomfortable and not having the body autonomy. And I know this is like nothing compared to what women have been through, but it's my own experience as close as I can relate is the fact of like it made me uncomfortable. I didn't talk about it for years. For a decade of my life I never talked about it because I was just like nobody's going to listen. It doesn't really
Mm-hmm.
matter. He's an
Mm-hmm.
authority over me.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I started talking about it and everybody else started being like, yeah, that's fucking weird. Guess what we figured out? That family is a bunch of fucking weirdos. That's
Mm-hmm.
what they do. And while there's not really anything we can totally do, because nothing that was done was illegal, unfortunately, at least to me, it's definitely one of those things that as we continue to point it out and more stories come out, it hopefully raises enough awareness that it's like other people who had something similar happen to them feel empowered to come forward earlier to say, and then also we can change the narrative in the future to kids to be like, no, you should talk about these things if this happens. The consent piece, like you were talking about with your own kids, of teaching them consent and to tell us like if something happens, you need to start talking about it. You need to it we need to change the way that we have viewed the world. It is set up to hide it. It is set up to shame people from talking about it, and it's time to change it. And I think it is. I think it's happening. I don't know how you feel about this. I wake up every day recently and turn the news on, which I know is not good to do first thing in the morning, but and I feel sometimes very sad and overwhelmed because I'm like, how can we recover from this? And
Mm-hmm.
then something sparks in me and I go, but we're talking about it. And to me, that's a signal that we are headed in the right direction because the more we talk about it, the more it comes to light. Eventually, enough people are going to say, this ain't the way to do this anymore. And we're going to change it and we're going to shift the narrative. I don't know if you feel that way, but I wake up a little bit hopeful every day that the narrative is going to shift and the way that we're patterning our lives and the way that we're dictating things that's going away. It's just going to take a very long time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of all over the map when I think about it. I think if, you know, if I could instantly implement one thing to make the world better, I know exactly what I would say. I would say stop hitting children. Like let's try that and see what happens. I'm pretty sure everything would get better. I mean, Hitler was beat within an inch of his life by his stepdad and his teachers at school. Trump, I don't even know. His parents were pieces of shit. You know what I mean? Like, this stuff messes up people, and those people then try and consolidate power. And a lot of the people who voted for Trump were hit as children by their caregivers and taught that that was loving and taught that obeying is the only way to stay safe and to not get hurt, and that there's always the baddie out there that deserves punishment. And once those baddies get punished, you'll feel better, right? So this is just authoritarianism. So that's what keeps me going with the Strong-Willed Project is I personally can't stop people from hurting their children and replicating patriarchal white supremacist values, into families, but I can be here for other people who are rethinking their childhoods and showing up for themselves finally. Like, I know it sounds cliche, but reparenting yourself is vital for these times. I don't know how to get through fascism without being very tender to my younger self who still exists within me. Like, that's the other thing I kind of want to tell people, and this was really hard for me, but like everything that happened to you in childhood actually happened, and it does have impacts. Educational neglect has impacts. Corporal punishment on a child's nervous system, it has impacts. Like, developmental delays if they were intentional or not, which for many homeschooling families, it absolutely was intentional to shield you from information and experiences, right? That would cause you to perhaps leave the fold. Like that has long term consequences. And being able to show up and grieve for yourself and listen to yourself, because exactly what you said. I want people to stop saying, why don't victims come forward? Because look at Epstein. We haven't had a single arrest in the
Yeah.
United States. I don't think we should ever ask that question again. And instead, we can say, how can we create conditions where victims can speak up and be believed? Now, if you were homeschooled like me, my parents, oh my God, if I even said, like, hey, I didn't love being homeschooled, like, some of those textbooks were really not great. Like, they would respond horribly, right? Because their entire worldview and ideology is connected to that. So they can't even hear me when I say, man, I really wish you guys had told me to go to college. I came from that kind of family, just like, you're a girl. You don't need to go to college, right? You're just going to serve God. So I was never told to go to college, nothing like that. So if I even bring that up to my parents, they can't hear that. How much less are they going to hear about abuse? You know what I mean? There's just so many factors built into what we are calling religious authoritarian homes where the kids cannot be listened to. And again, this starts in infancy when we have sleep training, ignore your baby's crying, to spanking toddlers. Don't listen to your toddler when they're crying and asking why mommy's hurting them, why dad's hurting. This refusing to listen to those with less power is baked into the system. And so the best way and the best way forward for any of us is to listen to those who have less power. I think in our society, children obviously need to be listened to. I have a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old, and they're pissed at the grown-ups in charge and the world they are inheriting. Okay?
Yeah.
They just are, because of course the kids are pissed at what the adults are doing, and we need to listen to them. They want to just be able to live their lives, and instead they have to deal with all of this bullshit. So I guess that's my takeaway piece is listen to the kids in your life, listen to the youth, and I guess that's what keeps me going forward. I was like, I do think we can change if we start prioritizing the rights of children, which does not mean parental rights.
Yeah. I think in the homeschool world, I know I bring this up almost every episode at this point, but the Coalition for Responsible Home Education is doing some really cool things. They
Yeah, they're
are
great.
almost the opposite of HSLDA.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way to describe it. But they continually put forth legislation and bills, and they are actively working to make the voices of children more heard in the homeschool world. And so I applaud them for what they're doing. Go check them out if you haven't checked them out, to the audience, because they're great. DL, is there anything we haven't hit? I also want to give you an opportunity to shout out the Strong Willed Project, what you guys are doing over there, and but yeah, is there anything we haven't touched on that's important?
And there's so much to say about this. I just think now is the time to, I'm going to use a Bible college phrase here. Now is the time to have a hermeneutic of suspicion when it comes to white Christian men. And just because so much in our culture has told us to obey them, that they are wise, that they need to be listened to, I think we can all take a step back and be like, is that actually true? That all deserves some suspicion to me. If people are interested, I've done a 5-part series on how purity culture is pedophile culture. Where I go into some of this stuff on the Mies Commission. We also talk about like the hallmarks of how serial child predators think. And then we're actually publishing a piece soon by R.L. Stoller where he talks about how to keep kids safe in communities and families. So just some nice practical advice. We're going to share the information that James Dobson declined to share with people because, unlike him, we actually do want to keep kids safe, and not just pay lip service to it. You can check that out. We also have a podcast episode called Purity Culture is Pedophile Culture. That's kind of like where my obsession has been. I'm currently shifting into some new, more creative projects, but my partner, Crispin Mayfield, is a therapist. And at Strong Willed, we're going to be focusing more on the work he's doing, which is going through year by year developmentally how some of these religious authoritarian parenting methods impact the developmental stages, and some tips and tricks for like how to heal if you experience some developmental trauma, and developmental delays, because that's what a lot of homeschoolers, we struggle with a little bit, some developmental delays. So if you're interested in that kind of content, you can check us out at Strong Willed. We're in the process of transitioning from Substack to Ghost, but by the time this goes out, you should just be able to find Strong Willed at Ghost and sign up and follow along. And I just want to say to anybody listening, you are worth investing in. You are worth taking the time to really learn how to be in your body, to feel your feelings, and to be a full human being. It's never too late to do this work. You have not missed out on the chance to be who you really are. You don't have to rush it. No matter what, the most important thing we can do in our lives, I think, is to learn who we are and learn how to honor that and be true to that. If you were raised like me, your gender, your sexuality, your preferences, all of that was severely policed. And we don't have to live under that anymore. Nobody gets to be in our minds except us. So that's just something I'll say as someone who was homeschooled and very, very, very sheltered. I've really enjoyed being a late bloomer. I came out as non-binary when I was 38. That's the same year I actually left Christianity. And my life has just gotten better and better as I become familiar with who I am, what I like, what I don't like. And I don't know. It's never too late. That's what I want to say.
I that's beautiful. That's a beautiful sentiment because I feel the same way of like it's never too late. Finding who you are, getting in touch with your body, your emotions, those kind of things. Like it is one of the best parts of my life currently, and I'm not alone in it. I think that's what's great, and that's what makes me resonate with content like what you're doing over at Strong Willed and some other shows and things like that. It's finding other people who are on a different journey, but on kind of a similar path as far as same motivations of like wanting to be a full-fledged human being
Yeah.
in touch with everything. And so I appreciate you for that. Links, of course, for everything that DL is doing down below. Check them out. Give it a listen. Give it a read. Go connect. It's great. It's been a huge like. It's not always easy, like we were talking about today. Like sometimes I'm like, I tell my wife, I'm like, hold my hand. This is tough. But it's good and it's important. And so thank you again for what you're doing, and thank you for coming on the show and destroying Adventures in Odyssey for us. But that's okay. There are plenty of other things that can take its place. Um,
Yeah, VeggieTales is fine. Okay. I'll just say
okay,
that.
okay,
I have no interest in dissing or interrogating VeggieTales because it's pretty great.
yeah.
Give people that.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in the same boat. I think the VeggieTales is pretty good. Um, but yeah, with that, to my audience, if you enjoyed, think about giving us a like, dropping a comment down below, however you're consuming this, audio, video, maybe you're reading the blog, I don't know. Whatever you're doing, leave a like, leave a subscribe, comment, whatever. All the internet things. You know how to do. And until we see you next time. Peace.